Good morning. I'd like to welcome everyone this morning. Glad you're with us. We're studying the book of Daniel. We're finally into chapter 8. We'll get into that a little bit. Are there any prayer requests before we begin this morning? Will you bow with me before we begin? Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for this beautiful day you've given us. We're thankful for this time that we can study your word and learn more about you and some of the things you'd like to have us to do to grow closer to you and however we can, Father. Father, we have a number of family and friends who are sick. We ask you to be with each and every one, strengthen them and restore their health. In Jesus' name, amen. We just finished up in Daniel chapter 7 where Daniel had this vision and it was interpreted. And he was distressed at the end of it. And we're moving on to chapter 8. And what do you know? Daniel has another vision. And we'll get into that today. And hopefully we can get to the interpretation of it and see if these two visions are similar, or if they're different, if they align with some of the things, or what's going on with the visions that Daniel's having. Daniel chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar, you remember his first dream? When did it happen? In the first year of the reign of Belshazzar. In the third year of the reign of Belshazzar the king, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, subsequent to the one which appeared to me previously. I looked in the vision, and while I was looking, I was in the citadel of Susa, which is in the province of Elam, and I looked in my vision, and I was beside the Ulai Canal. So we know where Daniel's having this, where he sees himself having this vision. And are these random visions that Daniel's having, that Nebuchadnezzar had? Are these just random things that are being popped into their head? Absolutely not. We know by studying the Bible and what's going on, we know that these visions are from God, and they're there for a reason. As was pointed out last week, a lot of these visions aren't for those folks. These visions are for us, for those that are in the time of the establishment of the church and what's going on now, and we're in that time frame now. And these visions that these folks are having, these interpretations, are for us of what was to happen in the future in Daniel's time. And Daniel was fortunate enough to have two of these visions, and we're going to be seeing the second one here. And in verse 2, Daniel says, I looked in the vision. That's the same phrase that he used in the verse vision he had when he was talking about it. And he goes, I looked in the vision, which emphasizes the intensity that Daniel's trying to observe these details that he's seeing in these visions. It's not a flippant type thing that he's trying to recall and study this vision that he's having. He's intense about this. He really wants to know what's going on. And in verse 2, he was in the citadel of Susa, which some versions say, I believe, Susa the capital. I looked at two New American Standards Bibles, and one said the citadel of Susa, the other said Susa the capital. And it's a little bit interesting about Susa. If anybody knows about it, please speak up. But I know it's a fortified city of Persia, which is about 200 miles east of Babylon. And today that'd be roughly current-day Iran area. And this is the vicinity back then where the Medes and the Persians had maintained their winter palaces. So it was part of their empire back then. And this is, how do I want to say this without giving away? I'm going to go to Esther chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. Now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, as King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne, which was at the citadel of Susa. What do we know about King Ahasuerus? Who was his wife? Esther. His wife was Esther. Do we know who his father was? His father was Darius. The same Darius we find out here in Daniel chapter 5 and chapter 6. Darius is the one of the Medes and Persians who conquered Babylon from Belshazzar, and he's the one that was tricked into making the law in place that got Daniel thrown into the lion's den. All these things are starting to tie together. And in the late 1800s, the palace of King Ahasuerus, that was his Hebrew name. His Greek name was Xerxes. His palace was discovered in the late 1880s. So there's actual physical proof of this king's palace in that area, which now ties current physical evidence to back then with what's all being tied together here in the book of Daniel. So it's quite interesting. This dream, that vision that Daniel's having, is it's all referring to things in the future, but it ties into the other aspects and other areas in the Bible, like, what's going on in the book of Esther as well. Any comments before we move on? Verses 3 through 8. Now we're going to start getting into the vision that Daniel has here. So we know a little bit of the background, where it's at, how it's tied into some other things. And now here's his vision. This is Daniel recounting his vision. Then I lifted my eyes and looked, and behold, a ram, which had 2 horns, was standing in front of the canal. Now the 2 horns were long, but one was longer than the other, with the longer one coming up last. I saw the ram butting westward, northward, and southward, and no other beast could stand before him, nor was there anyone to rescue from his power. But he did as he pleased and magnified himself. While I was observing, behold, a male goat was coming from the west over the surface of the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had a conspicuous horn between his eyes. He came up to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing in front of the canal, and rushed at him in his mighty wrath. I saw him come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him, and he struck the ram and shattered his 2 horns, and the ram had no strength to withstand him. So he hurled him to the ground and trampled on him, and there was none to rescue the ram from his power. Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in the place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. In one of the other dreams that we've seen and read here in the book of Daniel, there were 4 beasts, and one of them we knew was Babylon, one was the Medes and Persians, one was the Greek Empire, and then the other one was the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire was the last one there. It would seem to be the strongest and the most fierce and the toughest. But the beast, the rams and goat that we're talking about here, is not the Roman Empire. We'll get into who these are. It's going to be the Greeks and the Medes and Persians that we're going to be talking about here. But it's not who some would think would be the Roman Empire. In verse 3, when he's talking about, he saw the rams. And rams back in that day, there were many statues and many things of them. Rams were really a symbol or an emblem of power. And here, the ram that is being talked about is representing the kings of the Medes and Persians. And their empire came into the roughly the 553 to 550 era time frame. So this is all in the future of what Daniel is having here in real time for Daniel. And in Daniel's first vision, the kingdom of the Medes and Persians was symbolized by the bear. But here, it, for whatever reason, is being symbolized by a ram. And the ram is more of a symbol of Persia as opposed to the Medes and Persians, because the Persians were a more powerful empire later on than what the Medes were. Even though they kind of conquered Babylon together, they were still 2 separate entities. The Medes were strong at first, but in the end, the Persians were more powerful than what the Medes were. So it's more likely that this ram is symbolizing more of the Persians than the Medes or the Medo-Persian Empire themselves. And the ram is described as having 2 horns. One of the horns was longer, the shorter horn being the Medes. In the early years, like I said, they were stronger, and the longer horn would be the Persians. With the rise of Cyrus the Great from the Persian Empire, the balance of power shift from the Medes being more powerful to the Persians having the more powerful part of their combined empire, if you would speak. And eventually, in roughly 550, 551 BC, the Persians conquered the Medes. So the Medes, I don't want to say no longer existed, but they were no longer the force to be reckoned with. It was more the Persians as opposed to the Medo-Persian Empire. And here, being depicted in Daniel's dream, the ram, that's why it's coming about, that it's referring to the Persian Empire here. And in Daniel's previous dream, We saw that the bear that was in his dream that referred to the Medes and Persians, the bear was raised up more towards one side, symbolizing that of the two empires that were there, one would be stronger than the other, referring back to the Persians being the stronger of the empire in the symbol of the bear in Daniel's previous dream. A lot going on in these dreams that Daniel has. A lot to try to figure out why and what it is. Some of it is minute details that you might not think is important, like does it really matter that the Medes were less important than the Persians or vice versa? But when we get through the whole story and the whole interpretation later in chapter 5 or in chapter 8, it's going to make sense. And it is important for us to know the history of what's going on in the Bible so we can understand it better as it relates to things going on in the New Testament as well. In verse 4, Daniel saw in his vision that this ram was budding in various directions. And ironically, it only picks out 3 directions, westward, northward, and southward. And this is symbolizing the Medes and the Persians, their empire as they continue to expand. And as the ram was budding into these directions, the Medes and Persians expanded their empire in those directions. Budding westward, they conquered Babylon, Syria, and Asia Minor. To the north, they got Lydia, Armenia, and Scythia, and to the south, Egypt and Ethiopia. So it's referring to the expansion of their empire. And in the other dream with the bear, what did he have in his mouth? 3 ribs. Does that refer back to the conquests of the Medes and the Persian empires? Well, they took care of Lydia, they took care of Babylon, they took care of Egypt at various times. These 2 visions are different, but similar. Different animals represented them, but the same definition of what's going on here, of them conquering various things and what these animals are represented. But as I mentioned, it only sent 3 directions. It didn't talk about the east. Well, they did expand to the east, but it's not mentioned. It might be because what they conquered might not have been as important to this empire, but we know that they did expand to the east from the phrase that we read in Esther 1. I'll go back to Esther chapter 1, verses 1 again, if I can find that. Verse 1, now it took place in the days of Ahasuerus. The Ahasuerus reigned from India to Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. So we know that area, and we know that the Medes and Persians took that, so they expanded as far as India and Ethiopia. So we know they also went eastward. But here, in Daniel's vision, for whatever, they focused on the other 3 directions, which were larger, more popular, more significant people to conquer at that time. In verse 5, we see the second animal in Daniel's dream. So we're going from the ram, which is the Medes and Persians, to the goat. And this is coming from the west. What is west of where the southern Iran area? Further west. Keep going further west. Iraq, keep going further west. Eventually you're going to get to Greece. It'll take you a while, but eventually you're going to get to Greece. And that we see coming from the west in verse 5 here. Something's coming. Something's great coming. This goat is representing the Greek Empire. And we know that the Greek Empire, compared to Susa and Babylon and all them, is much further from the west. And it's saying that over the surface of the whole earth, it's moving without touching the ground. As the Greeks started conquering things, they started coming from the west, heading to the east. They started conquering a lot of things. And in chapter 7, in the vision that Daniel had, the Greeks were represented by a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings of birds. Wings of birds can be considered as flight and move swiftly as it's going around. So the Greek Empire was moving fast as they were conquering all these places, heading towards this ram that was there. And the goat that Daniel saw, just like in his previous dream, some of these animals had some weird things happen on them. He had this very strange horn that stood out. And this first horn, this horn that is there, is the first king of Greece. Does anybody know who the first king of Greece was?
Well, Alexander he's talking about.
He's talking about Alexander the Great.
Alexander's father was also a king.
Also a king.
But he wasn't expanding.
Correct.
He was more consolidating the Greek tribes.
Correct. So the first king that was really started expanding the Greek Empire was Alexander the Great. And he was born in 356 BC, and he is known for being one of the greatest military strategists back in that time. And he had this motto that there is nothing impossible to him who will try. And you think about it today, that does make sense. It's only impossible if you don't try. If you keep trying, you may eventually get it, but if you don't try, you will never get it. And he tried, and he made a lot of conquering throughout his military career. But he was also a very shrewd person, and he was very ruthless in what he did. History of Alexander the Great. He was son of Philip of Macedon. Philip united Greece and Macedonia, and Philip was planning to attack Persia when he was murdered. Now in Daniel's vision, we got the ram who is Persia, the goat who is Greece. So it's interesting that at one point that Alexander's father was planning to attack the Persians. So Alexander, he inherited his father's kingdom at a young age, 20 years old, when, Terry mentioned that his father was running other things in Greece, but his father was murdered, so Alexander inherited at 20 years old, and he was taught and tutored by Aristotle. That's a name we've all heard before, so he had a great benefit in his education, being taught by Aristotle, seeing things under his father. How he got to be so ruthless, don't know. How he became such a great military strategist, is it because of his teachings of Aristotle, the things he saw with his father? But he had all these things combined at the age of 20 years old. And after he took over, about a year and a half later, that's when he attacked the Persians. His father wanted to earlier, was getting ready to. He was killed, but a year and a half later, he goes in and attacks the Persians. And the Greeks and the Persians fought many, many times over many, many years. But in Alexander's conquest, I read it took about 3 years for him to complete that conquest. And I believe earlier when we were talking about this, it might have been chapter 4 or 5, when I was talking about the bear, I think you said the Greeks and the Persians fought for about 50 years overall.
Well, that was after Alexander died.
Okay. I couldn't remember if that was the prior to with Alexander's father or if it was, but they fought many, many years. But it only took about 3 years for Alexander the Great to conquer the Persians at that point, which is lining up with what's going on here in Daniel chapter 8. Any questions or comments about what's going on here? Yes, Ted.
Just a comment that solidifies what you said about Alexander the Great's determination. Tyre was an independent city, and it was predicted all over the Old Testament that a lot of things would happen to it, which all came true. One of them was that Nebuchadnezzar would attack the city, but Nebuchadnezzar, when he came there, the city tricked him, the short story, and went
today.
Because he knew he was gonna do it no matter what.
That's the ruthlessness that Alexander the Great had.
There's one more detail I like about that story. Part of the prophecy was that fishermen would dry their nets on the bare ground, as in the solid rock ground of the island, okay? And you can go there today, and fishermen are still drying their nets on the ground, because it's rock, and they can lay their nets out there, and they will dry. But the point was, there's no buildings, whereas when the people around the island, it was full of buildings. And Alexander tore it flat down to the bare rock. And it's still that way today.
And that's 2,000 plus years ago that happened.
And then you can see aerial pictures of that whole site where it happened. I mean, there's, the whole military battle that happened, conquer them is actually, you find it up online, it's actually quite an interesting story. But it was all predicted in the Old Testament as to what exactly would happen.
What happened to that area? You mentioned the prophecy about the nets being dried.
Yeah.
Do you know roughly where? New Testament, the Gospels?
No, it's in the Old Testament.
It's in the Old
I think
Testament?
I did there.
It's in the Old Testament. I thought
Okay.
it wasn't on there before, I can find it, but
Just curious to make notes for later on. I'll tie this together.
the Old Testament prophets,
Isaiah? We'll take your word for it, Tom. We trust you.
We'll find it.
Tom taught Isaiah, so it must be Isaiah.
It must be. It goes back to, I've said it many times and others made comments about how the Bible is just so tied together that humans can't do it to make it this tied together and come true in things that have been happening. We just can't do it. It has to have divine intervention.
Another interesting thing about that story, just in detail, was that Tyre was an international maintenance city, just like Switzerland. So there was no reason for people to come and pound on it, but they did, even though the odds were against that happening, because it's like
It's
all
location.
nations of the world coming and bombing Switzerland and taking it over. And Tyre was so arrogant, they hated fishermen.
A little twist to that story then. Wow.
It was Isaiah's cousin Ezekiel.
Okay. Yeah, there you go.
Yep. Yay, we found it. Ezekiel 26, 5.
Thank you, Tom.
The thing of it is, what you're showing here, what we're
It's
talking about here, is how all of the different parts in the Old Testament converge to tell us, if we know who they're talking about, a complete history of what was going on at those times and what would happen in the future. But it's told from God's perspective, not just to tell the history, but to give us reference points so we know that the Bible is true and is predictive of what's going to happen to get us the Messiah. All that's going on in there at the same time, but it's distributed all over the entire Old Testament without us knowing it in that way as a history and as a story of the Messiah. We don't always get it.
that's where it's important to study the whole Bible, not just bits and pieces, not just the New Testament.
Can I read, there's a couple of verses in Ezekiel 26 after verse 5. It's really says this so clearly. He's talking about Tyre. They will make a spoil of your riches and a prey of your merchandise, break down your walls, destroy your pleasant houses, throw your stones and your timbers and your debris into the water. I will silence the sound of your songs, and the sound of your harps will be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock. You will be a place for the spreading of nets. You will be built no more. For I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the Lord God.
Well, by saying you will be built no more is confirmed today that there is still nothing there, that is still bare rock.
There are fishermen that go there once in a while because it's a good place to stop the boat and dry their nets and stuff like that, but it's bare rock.
Historically, Tyre has been, they tried to rebuild Tyre over the last, I don't remember how many hundreds and maybe thousands or more years, but it's never happened.
Bill.
Also, when you read that, it also predicted how Alexander the Great was going to get there. Because it says, your buildings will be
Torn
torn
down.
down,
And all,
Just coincidence.
no, just coincidence, right? All this great conversation, because the simple question was about how ruthless Alexander the Great was and how it ties into other aspects of the Bible. And this is about talking about a man that his empire wasn't even established yet in Daniel's day. It's what's happening in the future.
One of the reasons why Alexander the Great might have been that arrogant, as we said before, is it's quite likely he believed that all those Old Testament scriptures were talking specifically about him.
Very possible.
And he's the one that had commissioned the Old Testament to be translated into the Septuagint, into the Greek version, and he carried it around. He gave copies to every place that he conquered and pointed out, hey, look at this part, it's talking about me.
I mean, if he's really thinking that that's about him, he could definitely go into these places thinking, I'm unbeatable. So, because it's saying it's about me, and I'm going to be undefeated in this. Yep. Tom?
I was gonna say one other good thing, I mean, there's a consistency, as you said, between the two prophecies of Daniel, like, Tyre, and it is in Isaiah 23 also, there's a huge prophecy about Tyre. I think Amos is another place.
Yeah,
that
they're
talks
about,
this.
they're about
So
three,
Tyre,
4, or 5.
yeah, Tyre has historically been a nation of evil that God has said that he is gonna deliver judgment. So, it, this repeats itself, and Daniel's almost a culmination just before it happens, really, but it's really a very consistent story throughout the Old Testament about those nations that have been seemingly getting away with their idolatry and paganism and whatever, but God said ultimately there will be judgment.
And in Ezekiel there's going to be, I believe it was Ezekiel, there's going to be torn down and nothing left. Bill, did you? Okay. You sure? Lucky you had something 4 people ago.
I did, but I think, I was just wondering, I was thinking Alexander the Great did all that stuff, and wasn't trying to fulfill the scripture, it just kind of happened. But then Ted said that he carried that all around with him, so my question was it a tactical, military tactical thing that he built that thing, or did he think of it there also as fulfilling part of the prophecy, taking it down to the ground? Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like Ted said, there's no way to
There's
know.
no way to know. I mean, we can think and assume a lot of things, but you can't get into his head without really knowing. But there's a lot of evidence proving one way and some proving the other. You just don't know. But it's interesting to think about that. Did he really go into battle thinking those things because hey, I am the one that's filling these prophecies when he's not the guy at all? Great comments, guys. Anything else? Let's continue on. In verse 6, we see Daniel seeing, in his vision, it's all a vision here for him, that the goat, the Greeks are attacking the ram, which is, the Persians. And this he's charging at him with everything he's got, which shows the ruthlessness of Alexander the Great when he was going after, kingdoms to overcome them. And, the Greeks eventually overthrew the Persians. And, history describes that. Excuse me. In verse 7, Daniel says, I saw him, referring to the goat, come beside the ram, and he was enraged at him. In a vision, you got this, one animal going after another, and he's already upset, he's mad, he's enraged at him. What could cause this? There's some folks that believe that when Alexander, if I can find my notes here, that earlier, how do I say this? After Daniel, but when the Greeks and Persians were going at it, that the Greeks were oppressed by the Persians. And perhaps the Greeks had not forgotten this. The note and time frame I have, it said some 150 years earlier the Greeks were oppressed by the Persians. But it never gave me a reference to where that 150 years was.
I can tell you a little bit about that. They tried to take over Greece at various times, but they
Persians.
couldn't do it. Yeah, and earlier. But the Greeks had established colonies on what today is Turkey. Western Turkey, where is the water, okay? Well, the other side of the water is Greece, okay? And they established a whole bunch of colonies along the coastline of eastern Turkey, okay? But that was in the realm of the Medes and the Persians. And the Medes and the Persians treated those Greek colony people very poorly for a long time. And it angered the Greeks back in Greece very, very much. And so it was the idea of conquering and all like that, when Alexander got all the Greek tribes together and formed the best army that had ever existed in the whole world up until that time. But it was revenge against what they had done to their Greek folks in the colonies in Western Turkey.
That's what I interpret this, it's already this goat being enraged at the ram, that there's some past history here, and that ties in with it. But I couldn't find a time frame of what it was with the 150 years. So the Greeks were already upset at the Persians as they're going after them. And in verse 7 it's saying, he struck the ram and shattered his two horns. That's referring to the two horns that were on the ram. So we're talking about the Medes and Persians. It was shattering them and overpowering them. And the ram had no strength left to withstand them. So this is when Alexander the Great, did the conquering over the remaining Medes and Persians, and they ceased to exist at that point because they were no match for the Greeks and that, if you want to call it a historical, ruthless army that Alexander the Great had established. And this had to do nothing but, so to speak, fuel the fire that Alexander the Great had, saying, I'm the greatest, I'm the greatest, I'm the best, nobody can beat me, nobody can conquer me. So he's starting to get very boastful along with his ruthlessness, and it's all about him. So he's thinking he's the one that's doing all these things. And in verse 8, the male goat magnified himself exceedingly. Not only was he being boastful, but Alexander the Great, he still kept conquering. He still expanding his territories. And in verse 8 it goes on, but as soon as he was mighty, so almost like at the peak of his thing, the large horn was broken. Alexander the Great, almost toward the peak of his military prowess, at the height of his power, he died. In 323 BC, he died at the age of 32. So he took over at the age of 20. He was there for about 12 years, and he was just getting to stride. I mean, he's peaking, and he dies. In reference here in Daniel's dream, that as soon as he got his power, which Alexander the Great did, the horn broke, and it's all over for him. And
Anybody know why he died?
that I do not.
He was a drunk.
Really?
Yeah, he actually was an alcoholic, and he drank too much, killed himself.
Today we call that accidental alcohol overdose, which is strange. But so he drunk himself to death. Wow.
That's what I read several places before. Celebrating too much.
Yeah. How many times have we read in Daniel somebody celebrating too much with drunkenness, and what happens? Not that they necessarily died, but things were happening. The one where they had that drunken party, and all of a sudden his hand started writing on the wall. And it goes on, and let's finish up with verse 8 here. And once this one horn's broke, once talking about Alexander the Great is no longer existed, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns toward the 4 winds of heaven. So 4 more things are sprouting up. And we know that in the Greek Empire, after Alexander the Great was gone, it was, I don't want to say divided into 4 kingdoms, it was divided into 4 areas amongst 4 of Alexander's generals. So Greek was divided from one major empire under one man's rule into 4 smaller, like I said, I don't want to call them empires, I don't know what they were called, but under 4 separate generals that were under Alexander the Great. And in the other dream, Greek was represented by a leopard that had 4 wings. It also had 4 heads, which are these 4 generals. So those 2 visions are lining up with each other. Even though the first vision was really talking about Rome in the end, this one's talking about Greek. The animals are different that are representing these empires, but it's coming out the same, that the four kings of the four generals that are representing Greek from one vision to the other is still happening. And then it refers to the four winds of heaven. This is referring to the four different directions. These men basically took Greek and separated it in four different ways as they were trying to establish themselves as partial rulers of the Greek Empire. Even though there were four together, each one still had their own agenda. They still had their own mindset of what they wanted to do. Not to become Alexander the Great, but to simulate him and try to become more powerful. Ted.
It bothered me a long time why they're changing animals when I'm studying this. Seems like it would make it confusing. But you have to stop and think, it's pretty simple. You have to stop and think that this was done over the course of Daniel's life, which was like, what do you say, 90 years or so?
Approximately.
I mean, these were not like one happened one day and one happened the next day. There could be 50 years between them. And God's not necessarily using the same animal because he wants to show something different. So it's not, it shouldn't be that confusing for us to see why he's using different characteristics of different animals at different times in Daniel's life.
These two visions happen to be about 2 years apart. But it's quite obvious. Go ahead.
Which two are you talking about?
The one we read in chapter 7, the leopard in that, versus here in chapter 8. 'Cause- But, well, we see it in others, but I look at it as if the exact same animals with the exact same description were used from one vision to another, it'd be easy to say, well, this is man-made, because you're just copying from one to the other. But you got, describing the different kingdoms, you got two distinct different animals with different, when you think of an animal, you think of different powers and abilities. You hear a leopard, then you hear a goat. Okay, they're completely different things. But when you hear a leopard to a bear, or a leopard to a lion versus a goat to a ram, you kind of see the same similarities between power from one to another. And then 4 heads, 4 horns. Okay, they're different items, but they're representing the same thing. So to me, it shows more of God's ability to keep things different, but yet it's all the same. It makes us as people to look and study harder to what is really going on here. And for the people back then, if Daniel said, I had this vision that had this leopard, bear, and lion, and then 2 years later, oh, I had this vision, this leopard, bear, and lion, well, this guy's crazy. He's having the same dream over and over. But he's having 2 separate visions, 2 separate dreams, but the outcome's the same. So, I mean, don't know how you look at it that way, but that's how I look at it. As God's doing something completely different by using different animals to represent the same thing. Your lucky day. Well, not yet. Terry's speaking.
I'm going to go ahead in the text, but I'm going to offer a suggestion as to why this is here in general. We had 4 kingdoms going down to Rome, and during the time of the Romans, we hear God's going to establish a kingdom. But it appears to me that this in chapter 8 is because he's going to talk about a different thing that happens during these 2 kingdoms, the Medes and the Persians, and then especially the Greeks. Because as we get some verses later, a great big thing happens during the time of Alexander's reign, which is very, very important to the Jews and to the world. And I'll just leave it at that, because we'll talk about that next week.
In chapter 8.
In chapter 8.
That's right. We'll pick up next week, starting with verse 9, and a little more of the dream here. Then later on, hopefully we might get to the interpretation of the vision. And some of the things that I come up with talking about here in the description of Daniel and the vision, I actually read ahead, and some of these things are coming right from chapter 8 later on when the vision is interpreted to Daniel, where I'm getting some of these names and things. So this is interesting that this is one of the dreams that things are actually spelled out by nations and whatnot versus other ones you have to do a little digging and studying, where Daniel's being told, this means this, that means that. And there's no denying what it is. There's no thinking that, oh, this means the Greeks, this means the Medes and Persians. No, it's written out as a fact of this is who these folks are. And hopefully we'll get to that next week. Thanks for being here today.
everything